We all like to think of love as this deeply personal thing, right? A choice just between two people. But what if I told you that our most intimate decisions, like who we marry, are actually shaped by these huge, invisible social forces? Well, today, we're going to dive right into the data on romantic relationships between immigrants and natives to see what's really going on.
It's a classic question, isn't it? But it turns out the answer can tell us a whole lot about the world we live in. See, the patterns of who marries whom, they reveal society's deepest dividing lines that show us the boundaries between different groups that are either, blurring or getting even stronger. So let's jump in and see what the data actually says.
All right, first up, before we get to any of the numbers, we really need to understand the stakes here. Why do researchers even bother studying this stuff? And why does it matter, on a bigger societal level, who marries whom?
Okay, so the main term you're going to hear a lot in this explainer is intermarriage. It's pretty simple, really. It just means a formal union, like a marriage, between an immigrant and someone from the native-born majority. Simple idea, but as we're about to see, it has some pretty profound implications.
You can think of intermarriage as a kind of social barometer. When the rates are high, it's a really clear sign that the social distance, that feeling of separation between groups, is shrinking. It means those group boundaries just aren't as important in people's everyday lives. It's a direct way to measure cultural integration, and it's also a powerful engine for assimilation. Why? Because the children from these unions, they're way more likely to intermarry themselves, which creates this self-reinforcing cycle.
So with that in mind, let's start digging into the data. We're going to start with a few factors that pretty predictably influence who marries whom, which generation they are, their gender, and their socioeconomic status.
The first one is pretty straightforward, generation. On the one hand, you have first-generation immigrants. They often arrive when they're older, sometimes they're already married, and they might face language or economic hurdles, so they're less likely to intermarry. But then you have the second generation. These are folks who grow up in the new country. They go to school and work alongside natives, they pick up all the local cultural practices, and naturally, that leads to a lot more intermarriage.
Now here's something that might surprise you. Gender plays a huge and really consistent role. Across Western countries, native-born men are roughly twice as likely to marry an immigrant as native-born women are. And the source suggests this might have to do with a stronger average preference among women for a partner of higher social status, which can sometimes put male immigrants at a disadvantage.
And that leads us right into our third factor, status. This probably won't come as a huge shock, but immigrant groups with higher skills, better education, and more wealth tend to have higher rates of intermarriage. They're just often seen as more attractive partners. So, okay, generation, gender, status. These are the predictable parts of the puzzle. But, and this is a big but, they are not the whole story. Not even close.
So now we get to the real heart of this whole thing. Because when you account for all of those other factors, one thing emerges as the most powerful dividing line of all. So what is this hidden force? Well, let's take a look at what the research found. And there it is. This is the core thesis of the research we're looking at. When it comes to predicting intermarriage for second-generation immigrants, religion is the single most powerful factor. That's a huge claim, right? So let's look at the evidence. Just take a look at this. This chart shows the percentage of second-generation immigrants in Europe who had one native-born parent. For Christians and non-religious people, it's a whopping 60%. But look at what happens next. For Muslims, that number plummets to just 18%. And for Hindus, it's only 11%. The gap there is absolutely enormous. And when we zoom in on second-generation European Muslims, the picture gets even sharper. A staggering 88% are in a union with someone of the same faith. But it goes even deeper than that. 81% are with someone of the same ethnicity. So the preference isn't just for a fellow Muslim, but often for a fellow Turk or Moroccan or Pakistan.
But the number on that table that really makes you stop and think is this one, 40%. That is the share of second-generation Muslims in this study who actually married someone living in their parents' home country. And finding a partner abroad like that has a very specific and pretty surprising consequence.
Yeah, it leads to this phenomenon which the source calls the permanent second generation. Here's how it works. When a second-generation immigrant marries a first-generation immigrant from their ancestral country, their children are, by definition, also second generation. And this dynamic can really slow down that whole cross-generational integration process that sociologists normally expect to see. Now, this pattern we've been talking about, with religion being so central, is most pronounced in Europe. But what happens when we cross the Atlantic? Well, the whole story changes because the main social dividing line changes right along with it.
And really, the key difference boils down to this.
While the main social boundaries in Europe tend to revolve around religion and ethnicity, in the United States, the most powerful dividing line has historically been race. And that creates a totally different context for immigrants.
So in the US, you have this very thick boundary between Black and white Americans, and that shapes everything. Black immigrants, for example, are more likely to marry within the established Black American community than with white Americans. And what's interesting is that unions between Asian or Hispanic immigrants and white Americans are also a bit rarer than similar pairings in Europe. The source suggests this could be because the group sizes are just so much larger in the US, or maybe it's simply because race is a more prominent social marker over here.
Wow. Okay, so we've looked at generations, status, religion. We've even compared whole continents. Let's try to pull all of these threads together and just summarize the key takeaways from this whole explainer.
So let's do a quick recap. First, we established that intermarriage is a really key barometer for social cohesion. Then, we saw that things like generation, gender, and status all have a predictable effect. The big reveal, of course, was that religion often turns out to be the strongest dividing line, especially in Europe. And finally, we saw how that primary line shifts from religion to race when you look at the United States, creating a whole different set of patterns.
But the source leaves us with one last and really fascinating complication. It's what you might call a social paradox. See, on the one hand, from an individual point of view, it can be totally rational to marry within your own group. The research actually notes these unions report higher satisfaction and they're less likely to end in divorce. But, on the other hand, from a societal point of view, higher intermarriage rates are a clear sign of a healthy, well-integrated society.
And that leads us to our final question. What happens when the very choices that lead to the most stable and happy relationships are also the exact same choices that reinforce our deepest social divides? It's a tension with no easy answer, and it really highlights this incredibly complex dance between personal love and public life.